for a pie, a donut and a Lipton iced tea each. So 40 years in that regard has changed a lot, but Sunday school, not much at all. So great to have you back with us. Now, we're just going to kick straight off with an introductory reading, and then I'll ask Brother John to come up and deliver the second study. As I said, to the title, Prepare and Plan. And in introduction, we'll ask Brother Eden Tierney to come forward and read Nehemiah chapter 2.
Reading Nehemiah chapter 2. And it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been beforetime sad in his presence. Wherefore the king said unto me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid, and said unto the king, Let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad, when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Then the king said unto me, For what dost thou make request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said unto the king, If it please the king, and if thy servant have found favour in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. And the king said unto me, for the queen also sitting by him, For how long shall thy journey be, and when wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Moreover, I said unto the king, If it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come into Judah. And a letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace which appertain to the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Then I came to the governors beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and some few men with me. Neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, and to the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. Then I went on to the gate of the fountain, and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass. Then went I up in the night by the brook, and viewed the wall, and turned back and entered by the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not whither I went or what I did, neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. Then said I unto them, Ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, how the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Then I told them of the hand of my God which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us, and said, What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Then answered I them, and said unto them, The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but ye have no portion nor right nor memorial in Jerusalem.
Just two men, a man and his boy, like dishevelled, you know. And I came to the second study, and I was feeling a bit hot, right? So I took my shirt off, or my jumper, I think it was, and to my horror, I had my t-shirt on completely inside out and back to front. With my tag hanging out here. It was horrific. And you'd imagine like Nick, Wilson, Crawford, all of them, like just absolutely humiliating. And I ended up going behind a screen and changing my t-shirt mid-talk. So anyway, I brought my two daughters to, you know, get a little bit more all over it. So checked myself, and I'm still not going to take my shirt off just in case, but hopefully we run smoothly. All right, so we looked this morning, obviously, at the introduction to this man, Nehemiah, and we saw his passion, didn't we, about building, that he had for his brothers and for his own spirit, and we saw that that's something that we want to adopt in our own life. The study is called preparation and planning. Now, whenever you build any project, on any kind of project in life, it's just so important to plan, isn't it? To think about your project. Now, Jesus said that, didn't he? When he told that parable about the people who were going to build something. And he'd observed that, obviously, in life. He looked at they come to build this great building, but he hadn't thought enough about the planning of it, and about what he needed, and about the materials, and how it was all going to go together. And he got to the point where he built the foundation, but he couldn't build anything more. And Jesus used a beautiful illustration of spiritual lives, and the need for thinking, analysing, and what we need to build our projects. And no different to that. It was a difficult project, and he had to think about it. He had to plan. Think about how it was all going to come about. And that's what this stuff is. It's about how he went. The strategies he uses to get the project done, and the life of our Ecclesials. Notice when you come to need a clear plan in his mind as to what he needs to do. In fact, he already had that clear plan when he goes to prayer in the previous chapter of Nehemiah 1. Look what it says. It says, "O Lord, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servants who desire to fear thy name, and prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the soul of the cupbearer." So that tells us, doesn't it, when he was making that prayer, he'd already thought about what he was going to do. That he was going to go to the king, and he'd already planned out what he was going to ask him and what he was wanting to achieve. He'd thought carefully about that. And he knew that that's what he was going to ask God for, and what God's assistance he needed to do that. And when he comes to the king to ask him the next day, and we know that he comes in verse 3 and 4, We thought about that this morning. It says, he was worried about being sorrowful. Then he comes, verse 3, and he says, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad when my city lies waste and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? So my city's wrecked. The gates are all burnt out with fire. This is the intent for which I'm coming to ask for you to give me something. And interestingly, it's always interesting just to think about this, verse 6 says, and when he asked that question, the king said unto him, and the queen sitting behind him. And most people, a lot of people think that was probably Esther, which is great to think about, isn't it? That in this moment of need, when he's going to the king, he's got Esther there, who he knows, and he would have intimately known her, if that was indeed her. He knows what she stood for, and he knows that she's there for him and what he's trying to achieve. So he goes there with this intent to rebuild the gates of this wall. And he says that in verse 5. He's very specific about what he's trying to achieve. The king said unto him, I said unto the king, if it please the king, and if thy servant have found favour in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. So he says, he's got a plan. We looked at that. And his plan is to rebuild Jerusalem. And he's also given the outline of exactly what he needs to do. The walls are decimated and the gates are burnt with fire. I'm requesting for you today to send me back to Judah that I might go and rebuild that city. That's what he's planning to do. Now, he also gives him a timeline of how long he thinks it's going to take. So he's thought about the timeline as well. Like the king fires straight back to him. Verse 6, he says, for how long shall your journey be? Okay, how long is this going to take you? Obviously, Nehemiah was an important man in the kingdom. How long is this project going to take you? It sounds like it's this enormous project that you're going to have to actually do. And it says, so it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. So he gave him a timeline. He'd obviously mapped it all out, and he'd worked out, this is how much time I need to build this project. This is the extent of the project. And he rolled it out and he showed the king, this is what I need to do. And it says the king was pleased to send him. He saw that this man, he knew what this man was like. He's an organised man. And he gave it to him. Now, the other thing he says, so he sets him a timeline. The other thing he does in verse 7 is he says, moreover, I said unto the king, if it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come to Judah. So he says, what else I need is I need you to give me security, because I'm anticipating that there's going to be trouble when I get there. So I need you to send a delegation of your officials to be with me, to make sure I get across there, and so that to make sure when I arrive there, I'm coming with some kind of delegation, because I know that there's going to be trouble when I get there. So he asks for security. The other thing he does is he asks for building materials, for specific building materials that he would need to achieve the project that he's going to achieve. Verse 8, and the letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace which appertain to the house and for the wall of the city. I need timber and I need stones for the wall. So he knows exactly what he's going to do. He knows the exact extents of the project and the materials, and he's able to give a list, like a bill of materials. This is what I need in order to go over there and achieve it. Right? Materials in order to do it. It was a very clear plan. And verse 17, he articulates that later when he's at Jerusalem, and he says to them, come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be in reproach. So he knows very specifically what he's going to do. It's not broad, it's very specific as to what his purpose is. Now, the other thing that's interesting is 4 times in this chapter, right? So he's got a clear plan. 4 times in this chapter, he says, God's with me in this plan. Verse 8, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Verse 12. What my God had put into my heart to do at Jerusalem. God's with me on this project. I need all these things and I need to achieve this specific plan, and I know that God has put into my heart what needs to be achieved. The good hand of my God was upon me, verse 18. And then finally in verse 20, the God of heaven will make us prosper. I know that this is going to be achieved. I know this plan that I've done the timeline for. I know that God is with me and it will be achieved. Now, how on earth was Nehemiah able to know with such specifics how to plan, what to plan for, what he needed, and more importantly, that God was actually absolutely by his side in the whole process? How did Nehemiah know that? Well, you remember at the end of our last class, we looked at the fact that Nehemiah prayed that amazing prayer to God, and we saw in that prayer that he basically plagiarised the entire prayer from the book of Daniel. He had read the book of Daniel. He loved Daniel. He saw in Daniel a man like himself. And so he'd done very detailed work in trying to find out what Daniel was and what he stood for and what his prophecies were about. Now, let's just come to Daniel chapter 9 and we'll see what other information he was able to get from Nehemiah chapter 9. And we know that he read it because he could quote it off by heart. At that end of that prayer that Daniel makes, an angel appears to Daniel and is pleased at the prayer that Daniel's given, and then gives Daniel a prophecy, telling Daniel, giving him an idea of what lays ahead of him and the nation for him. Because that's what Daniel wanted. That's what we all want, don't we, when we go to God in prayer? Give us some kind of direction as to what we've got ahead of us. That's what he prayed for. And God sent an angel, and the angel comes to in verse 22. And he informed me, well, actually verse 21, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, so it wasn't just any angel came, Gabriel comes, whom I had seen in the vision of the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of my evening oblation. That'd be good if we made a prayer and you received that kind of response, wouldn't it? Gabriel comes down, touches you on the shoulder, right? That's what happened to Daniel. And this is what he said to him. And he informed me and talked with me and said, "O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding." I'm going to give you a secret message, Daniel, which is going to be it's going to give you insight into what you need to know, what's ahead for you and for your nation. Verse 23, at the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth, and I am come to show you, for thou art greatly beloved, therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. He says, God loves you, Daniel, and I've got a personal message to give to you, to pass on to you. And here it is, verse 24 and 25. It's the prophecy of the 70 weeks. It was going to be this period of time about what was going to happen from here right through until when Messiah came. And that was going to be a period of some 400 years. And verse 24 and 25 tell Daniel what's going to happen in that period. 70 weeks I have determined upon thy people and upon thy city, thy holy city, to finish the transgression and to make the end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision of the prophecy unto the amount, anoint the most holy. So he says, this is all about this future Messiah, which Israel's been looking forward to. And I'm going to give you a time scale, Daniel, as to what's going to happen between now and when that Messiah will come. And he goes into specifics in verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, which is what Cyrus had said would happen, unto Messiah the Prince shall be a period of 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and the street shall be built again, and the wall, even in a troublous time. And then after 62 weeks, then Messiah shall be come and cut off. So he gives him a very specific prophecy with a very specific time scale. He says it's going to be 70 weeks, and we know that these 70 weeks are representative of 490 days, which often in Scripture, 490 days are representative of years, day for a year. And so the period was going to be this period of 490 days. This period before Messiah would come from when Daniel was taught. But he then broke that period into 2 periods of time. He said there's going to be first a period of 7 weeks or 49 years. And in that period of time, Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt again, and specifically the streets and the walls. But it's going to be a troubling time when that happens. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be opposition to that project, and they're going to struggle to build those walls. And then after that, there's going to be a period of 434 years after Jerusalem has been built between when Messiah will come. Right? What did that prophecy tell Nehemiah when he read it? And we know that he read it. He knew what was going to happen in his period of time. God told him, didn't he? 2 things that came out of that were, 1, Jerusalem would be rebuilt, the walls specifically and the gates. And then after that, Messiah would come. And it even gave him a rough timescale of when that was going to happen. Now, what did Nehemiah personally learn from that prophecy? He knew that Jerusalem would be rebuilt again. As we said, specifically the walls and gates. He knew a rough timescale. He might not have known it exactly, but he was able to prophetically work out, okay, when would that have started? When are that 49 years? When's that going to end? Where do I fit in it? And he worked out, actually, I'm right here. I'm actually in this spot. I'm in this prophecy. I'm part of it. He also knew that it was not going to be easy, didn't he? He knew there was going to be opposition to the project, that people were going to try and stop him. It was going to be a troublesome time. And so he needed to work through that. God didn't sugarcoat, did he? The challenges that lied before that man. But he ultimately knew after, and this is what he was probably most passionate about, that it was after that that Messiah would come. The promised one that would come. So Nehemiah put together this amazing, remarkable plan of how he was going to rebuild the city. How did he do that? He did that by reading and understanding the Bible. He did that by reading and understanding the prophecies of God and how they related to his time and how he fitted into them. You know what? Nehemiah, in the whole book of Nehemiah, as far as we know, never received any kind of vision from God. God never spoke to him. God never told him what to do. The only thing he had was God's word. But he used God's word, brothers and sisters, to find himself in that. And that's the most important thing. Verse 12 of Nehemiah chapter 2 says this, I saw this plan and I saw what God had put into my heart to do at Jerusalem. So he took all that plan and he took that prophecy and he read what God said about what his time would be like, and he said, I want to do that, and that's my project. And I can see that God is working in me to achieve that project in me. And that's very powerful, isn't it? Now, we can often feel in our lives, both personally and both ecclesially and even from a wider brotherhood, we can feel like, what should I do? What's my role? Like, the world is in this kind of condition. How should we deal with that at this particular time? How can we navigate the particular moments of time that we're in? But Nehemiah tells us that the way we should do it is to read his word. It's pretty simple, isn't it? But read his word specifically in the way that Nehemiah did. Read to understand what God has told us about our time. And that we're no different to what Daniel and Nehemiah were back then. You remember what he said to Daniel, what Gabriel said? He said, God's going to show you what's in your period of time because you're his beloved servant. And so therefore I want to let you know all of the information I can to tell you about what it's going to be like in your time. But it's up to you to search that out and find it and to see what your time is going to be like. And God's no different to us. He's given us prophecy. He's given us the word of God. He's showed us the principles by which we need to live. But he wants us to look into it and see what those challenges will be involved. And most importantly, like Nehemiah did, he wants us then to take that on personally and say, God is working in my life to bring about this purpose or that purpose. Or I need to stand up for this principle because I understand what God has said my world's going to be like. And if I stand for God, then I've got to stand up and take that principle and stand for him. That's what Nehemiah was like. And that's what we need to be like as well. So, let's go back to Nehemiah chapter 2. He's armed, isn't he, with a very, very specific and careful plan in order to go to this city and rebuild. And he travels all the way across. Well, here gives you a rough time scale, okay, of what he did. He gets the bad news in Nehemiah 1 verse 1. He does 4 months of planning, right? 4 months from when he hears about that news to when he actually leaves. If you work it out, it's actually 4 months of planning. So planning was a big part of it, about what he needs to do. Then he took 4 months to travel to get there. So he then had to travel all this way to get to Jerusalem. And when he got there, it actually took 52 days only to complete the project. So the vast majority of the project was in the planning and in the 4 months travel before he gets there for 52 days to rebuild. And he arrives in Jerusalem in verse 11. And when he arrives in Jerusalem, the first thing he does is this. It says, and I came to Jerusalem and I was there 3 days. So he arrives there and he just paused for 3 days. Right? And just thought about things. He's a man like that. He actually is very careful in the way he thinks and the next thing that he does. And then it says in verse 12, he arose up in the night, I and some of the few men with me, and neither told I any man what God put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well and the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and the gates thereof that were consumed by fire. Then I went on the gate of the fountain and to the king's pool, that there was no place for the beast that he could pass. Then I went up in the night by the brook and viewed the wall, and turned back and entered by the gate of the valley, and then I returned. So he waited for 3 days. And then he went by night. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't say, oh, I'm here, Nehemiah, your great saviour. He went by night, just him and his horse or his donkey or whatever he had. And he did a thorough survey of the walls. He went everywhere, okay? Went all around that wall to actually compare the report with what the condition actually was. So he could see what he needed to do, right? Very careful about his spirit, the reconstruction of his walls. Here's Jerusalem, right? Just to give you a bit of picture of the scale of the project that he was doing. This is in the time of David, right? Actually quite a small city when David was there, right? This is what it grew to in the time of Solomon, right? So Solomon put this massive extension up the top here. And of course, he built the temple, right? So the temple was up there on the top. Then in the time of Hezekiah, Jerusalem almost reached the extent of its size, like in the Old Testament. So he did a big renovation out here at the side and put a whole lot more condos on the side here and apartments. Then he had to have people managing strata and stuff, and it got a nightmare, right? It was an absolute nightmare. And then this is the time of Nehemiah. And this wall here, right, is the wall that we're talking about. So he didn't rebuild this huge wall that went out here. He just rebuilds the wall really as it was under Solomon's time. That's the extent of the walls that he built. And then that's what Jerusalem looked like at the time of Christ. So They eventually went back out and built this huge section out the side here. But essentially the same wall stayed there, right, from the time of Nehemiah to the time of Christ. Now, if you've been to Jerusalem, this might be interesting to you. If you haven't, then it probably won't. But this is the old city of Jerusalem today, okay? This is the extent of the walls, right, the old walls. And there's the four quarters, isn't there? The Islamic quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter. What's the last quarter? Christian. The Christian quarter, that's right. Here's the walls of Nehemiah that he's going to rebuild, right? So it's only part of the wall, and I'm assuming that none of that original wall is there now, but you know, this is the section of wall that he built, okay, which is really the city of David that was down here, and then up around this section, right? 6 kilometres is the distance of that wall going all the way around. Now, just to give you a modern day sense of the size of that, what I've done is drawn the walls of Nehemiah, and I'm going to superimpose on it the Australia's iconic landmark, just to give you the scale, and you'll know exactly when I put this on there. Of course, that's how big it was. And of course, it's the MCG, right? So the MCG fits perfectly in the top section of those walls, right? And that, if you have been to the MCG, it gives you an idea of the scale and the size of the walls that Nehemiah was building. They were, you know, it was a massive job, really, right? With all these walls around here. And as I said, some of them, you know, 30 metres tall in some sections, in some of the towers. So Nehemiah firstly goes around and he analyses all that wall and he compares it with the plan that he had. And then once he's done that, he brings that to the all the people. And he does that in verse 16 and 17. Well, we'll read, verse 17. Then said I unto them, so he comes to all the rulers and the priests and the nobles and the rulers of the Jews. And it says, yes, see the distress that we are now in. I see how Jerusalem lies waste, and the gates thereof are burnt with fire. Come and let us build the walls of Jerusalem, that we may no more be a reproach. And then I told them of the hand of my God which was upon me, and also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, let us rise and build. So Nehemiah comes to all the leaders, and many of these people have been here for now years working on this project. Some more dedicated than others. And he's got to somehow motivate these people to reinvigorate them to get back into working and doing that project, right? And he's very clever in the way that he does that. Because this is what he said, as we've just read. You see the trouble that we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins, its gates burnt. Come, let us build the walls of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And I just want to highlight a few words there that Nehemiah used very specifically as a great leader to try and rebuild those walls. He said, you see the trouble that we are in. Let us come and build that we may no longer suffer derision. Now, he had every right, didn't he, to come from Susa the palace. He's a very, very high up official. Right, he's got all these special letters, he's got all this money, he's got all this cash, he's got all this material. He could have rolled into Jerusalem and said, what the heck are you all doing? Right? You've been wasting time. Some of you have been doing nothing for years, right? Sitting back on your backsides doing absolutely nothing. And look at the project, it's gone rubbish. But he doesn't do that. He says, we're in trouble. And I'm in it with you. And I feel the pain that you've been going through. And I've been receiving all the messages from you as an Ecclesial and the things that you've been going through. And I'm right here with you to help you in building your project. He put himself, brothers and sisters, on the people's level, which was so important, to be part of that project and not see himself as better than anyone else. And then as he said, in verse 18, he said, let us rise up and build. And they strengthened their hands for the work. So they responded to that message really well. They said, yeah, you're right. And it's great that you're here to help us. We want to get up and reinvigorate this project. And it's great that you've come here to help us. And so they strengthened their hands for the work to be involved. Nehemiah empowered them to build for themselves, he didn't just think, I'm going to come here and do it myself. And that's what great leaders do, right? They inspire others to build with them. Now, we're all leaders in our ecclesia, whether we like it or not, in some capacity. Some of us might be leaders, in some kind of official capacity in the meeting. Others of us will be leaders of our family. Some will be leaders of the youth group. Some will be leaders of Sunday school. And some young people will be leaders of other young people. They don't even know they're leading, but they will be leading because everyone's watching people all the time. We're all leaders. And Nehemiah was a leader as well. And we all have a responsibility, like Nehemiah did, to bring other people along with us and not to be the champion out in front and different from everyone else, because that's not the way to lead. And Nehemiah wasn't like that. And you know what? Jesus wasn't like that. Jesus is the most amazing leader that ever lived. You look at the way that he led, the way he taught his disciples. He led them along. And you know what he did most of the time? He pushed them out in front to do it. Remember the feeding of the 5,000, right? Where they're like, oh, what are we going to do here? We've got 5,000 people and stuff. He does the miracle and then he gives it to them and he says, I want you to take it out. And I want you to give it to each one of the people. Because you know what? My plan has to be worked through you. You've got to take on this message. You've got to be the ones that take the gospel to the rest of the world. Jesus was about empowering others to be leaders themselves. And all of us have got a responsibility to do that in the leadership capacity that we all have. And we all are leaders, brothers and sisters, in some way. And you see that in the way Nehemiah brilliantly arranges the wall to be built. And the arrangement of the building of that wall is actually described for us in one of these comprehensive lists in Nehemiah chapter 3. And it lists all the people that were involved in that wall. Okay, here's the wall that needed to be built. And part of his plan was he said, okay, who's going to be involved? How many people we've got? Right. I need to allocate all these people to these different sections. And he actually divided, in Nehemiah chapter 3, he divided the wall up into 42 different sections. And he gave 42 different groups a different section of responsibility and ownership. I remember going to this work conference thing once, and often obviously, most of the time what they speak is just absolutely rubbish because it doesn't even apply to what you're trying to do, right? But I remember this guy said this one thing that I remembered, and it's true, and we try and apply it in our small little work that we do. And what he said is, ownership, let me read it and not butcher it, what gets owned gets done. Very simple, what gets owned gets done, but it's actually very true. If you just give something to someone and let them go and let them actually have to own it for themselves, they have to take responsibility for it. And they have to get it done, because if they don't get it done, it's their name that's on the line. And see, Nehemiah was very smart to be able to do this. He actually gave people ownership of their particular projects. Now, there's two, extremes of what can happen with that. The first thing that can happen is no one takes ownership or responsibility, and so nothing gets done. And that can happen in our own life and in ecclesial life and in families. But no one takes responsibility. So that's one extreme that can happen. The other extreme is that one person or a couple of people take all the responsibility upon their shoulders and say, I'm going to do it all. Unless I do it, it's not going to be done right. And it's so easy to fall into either one of those two categories. Right, to think, I'm done with it, right? I'm not taking any responsibility. You can go and do it, right? Because I'm not going to do it right or whatever. And it's easy to go the other extreme and think, oh, well, they can't do it right. I'm going to take it and do it myself. But Nehemiah chose the beautiful middle road. And he said, I need to allocate people to different areas of responsibility and give them ownership to take it over. And so he did that. He divided the wall into 42 sections. And you know what? Some people got bigger sections. Some people had ability or capacity or opportunity to build bigger sections. One guy named Shalom, he had daughters. He built an enormous section of the wall, right? 5 daughters. He must have had just huge ripped daughters, right? That built an enormous section of the wall. So some people built enormous sections of the walls, but there's other people in Nehemiah chapter 3, and it's really fascinating to go through Nehemiah chapter 3 and read it all. There's some people, like in verse 10 and verse 23 and verse 28 of Nehemiah chapter 3, who just built the section out the front of their own house. So Nehemiah said, I can see your situation, and I understand your capacity. And I just need you and your family just to build your section out the front of your house. And that's going to be essential to the wall. So some people had big sections and some people had smaller sections according to their several abilities. And that's what Jesus said in the parable, didn't he? He said some people have more opportunity or ability. It's not because they're better than anyone else. It's just because that's the way life works out sometimes. And that can work out for age too. We can have more opportunity and ability when we're younger than when we're older. But all of the people are needed in the sections of those walls. And all of us need to identify a section of that wall that is mine, that I can take ownership for. That's what's important. I remember this brother from Melbourne, right, who used to come to every single combined event, right? For years. And he was he did this for years, probably 30 or 40 years. Any combined ecclesia was having an activity, if there was any fraternal or any, whole Melbourne-wide thing, he would come there with this whole entire trailer of audio, right? It was a trailer. He had an audio trailer, right? And he would be there, before anyone else arrived, setting up cables that, went everywhere. And he would be there way before anyone else has gone, setting up all these different cables. We've got an audio guy here, right? I always think about this brother and think he must have been shattered when that iPod or something came along, right? Or the iPhone, and some guy just came out and put that one thing on there and pressed record, right? And he'd been taking this trailer around for years. But I remember that brother as a young person, as a kid, growing up, always there. And you know what? He found his spot. And he was passionate about all the chords and all these different things, right? And he played an essential part in ecclesial life. I miss him. I miss seeing him there. And all of us brothers and sisters have got an important part to play in the role of our ecclesia. We've just got to find it. And own it. And be passionate about it. And that's what Nehemiah tried to do with the building of this wall. Now we can think, okay, that guy was super good at audio, right? And he knew all the cables and stuff. What's my role? I can't do anything. Well, the interesting thing about Nehemiah, right, is that these are all the people listed in Nehemiah chapter 3 that built on the wall. There's high priests. There's men of Jericho. There's Tekoites. People actually came from outside of the truth and joined into Israel. There's temple servants. There's Gibeonites. You remember the story of the Gibeonites that came into the house of Israel. They weren't Israelites, but they came in to be identified with the Gibeonites. There was goldsmiths, right? You imagine the goldsmith's hands, these beautiful, fine hands, right? Like my hands, right? Embarrassing man's hands, right? That haven't seen a day's work in all their life, right? These are the kind of people. Goldsmiths, chemists, right? You imagine the chemist's hands working on the walls. There's rulers. There's family groups. There's some individuals mentioned just on their own. And there's other people that built in teams. There's Levites and there's priests. There's merchants. There's traders. There's businessmen. But you know what you don't see on that list? A qualified builder who had all the experience and know-how and expertise to say, you know what, I'm going to take control of it. You guys don't have to worry because I know everything what to do. There wasn't one listed in that group. Because, brothers and sisters, all of those people were needed and played an important role in that particular wall. Everyone was needed. And of course that's the same for ecclesial life. It's the same for ecclesia at Riverwood. It's the same for Blackburn. It's the same for all ecclesias. Nehemiah understood that his project needed a diverse group of skill sets to be able to achieve this project. people from different backgrounds, from slightly different ways of building, from slightly different ways of life, from slightly different ages, from slightly different cultures. Yet when brought together, they were able to build and do amazing things. I always think about how amazing and beautiful it is, the ecclesia that God's designed. But you think if you were just in the world and you weren't part of the ecclesia, right? Who would you hang around with? You'd speak to people at work and stuff as to who they hang around with. Who they hang around with is like a very small demographic of people who they've known from school or something, or they've known from work, or they go and join the footy club because everyone, is into footy, right? The ecclesia is so unique because what it does is it brings together people that you would actually never normally be brought together with. Older people and younger people. Skilled people in this area or that area. People who are really good at welfare and other people who are really good at administration and working in that particular capacity. And God's beautifully knitted this ecclesia together, right, to create this amazing group. And you know what? That's what that word in Nehemiah chapter 3 means, right? It goes on in Nehemiah chapter 3 to say there was a family here and at their hand there was another family. And at their hand there was another family. And that word hand, at his hand, means knitted together. And so this beautiful picture is of this ecclesia working together and bringing together this ecclesia all together, formulated and knitted together. It's a beautiful picture, isn't it? And it's a wonderful example from this man about how we can practically apply that in our life. Now, Nehemiah is full of these lists, like Nehemiah chapter 3. They're the kind of lists that you get to with the readings with the kids and think, oh my word, like this is going to be an absolute nightmare. Even on a Sunday morning, you're like, oh, let's skip this particular chapter and go to a different one. In Ezra chapter 2 is a chapter full of lists. He records the 897 people, 7,337 of the servants. There was 200 singers. There was 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, 6,721 donkeys. And then in Ezra chapter 7, he repeats the same list all over again with the same minute detail about all the people, all their stuff, everything they brought. And then it happens in Nehemiah chapter 3. And then later, 2 or 3 more times in Nehemiah, God records meticulously all these lists of all the people and what they did and where they came from and the specific section of the wall that they built. Why did God do that? Why does God care about the 621 donkeys that the first people brought over and record it with such detail down to the last donkey? Why does God care about that? Because he knows intimately, brothers and sisters, all of us. And he understands what we're doing in every bit of our capacity in our life. You look at this beautiful verse in Malachi, which we know, but it's beautiful to think about it in this context because Malachi was writing at the same time as Nehemiah. And so he gives an explanation as to why he would be interested in all the different people that are working on the wall. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 16 to 18, or 16 to 17, I'll read these verses. Then they that feared the Lord spake often one with another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Lord and thought upon his name. And they shall be mine, said the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make my jewels, and I will spare them as a man spares his own son that serves him. See, God told Malachi here that everyone matters and that God meticulously recorded all the people and all the ways in which they were helping upon the wall. And he says, you know what they're like? He says they're like my treasured possessions, my most treasured jewels, right? The things that I keep most precious to me. That's what they're like. He said, they're like my son, my only son, my precious son. We all know about our children's lives, don't we, and about what they're doing. We're all interested in what our family's doing and what our kids are doing. And God says, I know intimately you like my own children. And I care about you. And that's sometimes hard for us, isn't it? When we're building our wall in 2022, we think, oh yeah, God was interested back in the time of Jerusalem when they were all there with all that kind of stuff. But God, brothers and sisters, considers us his treasured possessions here in 2022. And he knows about you and your family. And he knows about your ecclesia. And he knows about the one dentist and the 4 accountants and the guy that works for the government, for Strata, and the 4 Audis and 4 Raptors and 6 Fords and a Nissan. He knows about all those different things about our life. Because we're his treasured possession. He loves us. And he's intimately involved in all of the parts of our life. And we're going to see that. And we're going to, like Nehemiah, take ownership for the wall and the section that God wants us to take ownership for. Let's finish in this beautiful verse in Revelation chapter 21. Because this is God telling us that, yes, you are part of my city. And I care about you just as much as those people that worked upon that wall. Revelation chapter 21, verse 24 to 27. And as I said earlier in this study, that this is the finished picture of Jerusalem. This is us as part of God's beautiful kingdom. And he writes this from verse 24 to 27. He says, and the nations of them which are saved shall walk in the light of it, in this beautiful finished kingdom. And the kings of the earth do bring their glory and their honour into it. And the gates of it shall not be shut all by day, for there shall be no night there. And they shall bring the glory and the honour of the nations into it. And there shall in no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever worketh abomination or maketh a lie. But these are the people that will be in it, they which are written in the Lamb's book of life. And God's still writing, brothers and sisters, that book. And we're part of it. Our meeting is part of it. And you've got to see yourself as part of it. And you've got to see your narrative and your section and you're part of it and own it, like those people in the time of Nehemiah did.
Well, thanks very much, Brother Jonah, for some very practical lessons there. Probably just a few things that stood out for me. The critical part that we all play, every single one of us as leaders, whether young or old, and regardless of age and any other differences. Some of those important lessons around seeking God and making sure that God is with us and the confidence we can have in God being with us, but also taking our own initiative and preparing and planning regardless of our knowledge or awareness of that fact. So it's really great practical lessons there, so thanks very much. Okay, so just a few announcements quickly for the rest of the day. 12:30 is lunch. I'm sure these people are well aware of their duties over lunch, so I don't need to mention them, but I will just in case. Jared Dodson, Jem Harden or Tom Russell didn't realise that they were helping out with lunch. So lunch is at 12:30. This afternoon, so far so good with the weather. It wasn't forecast to be that flash, but it is a free afternoon for whatever activities we might like. So let's hope the weather holds off for a bit of outdoor activities. And then dinner at 6 p.m. and we have Garrick, Rick Steele, Gemstone and John Unwin helping out with dinner tonight. Then what's tonight? I haven't got instructions on tonight. At about 7:30? 7:30 after dinner, so we look forward to trivia night tonight. So let's then close our second session and morning together with song Seek Ye First, and then our brother Rick Steele will close in prayer.
Our loving and gracious Father in heaven, we bow before you now. We thank you for the many blessings that you give to us day by day. And we thank you for the beautiful day that you've given us and the weekend we've now got together around your word to consider the example and life of Nehemiah. And we've been encouraged this morning by his example of leadership. We've been encouraged by the way in which he was planful in his approach to the development of that spiritual house. And we do see around us many challenges to our ecclesia, to ourselves, to our own spiritual projects in the world that surrounds us. And it threatens to break down our walls in many different ways and philosophies. And we ask that you might help us to work together as an ecclesia, that we might follow after a similar pattern as Nehemiah did. And so might we all, Father, might you help us all to see our part in this project, that we might find that part, we might take ownership of that part, and that we might recognise the strengths in others as they play their part, as we are body made of many members. And so we thank you for the considerations this morning, and we ask that you might help us to apply these lessons practically in our ecclesia. And we ask for your blessing now, and we thank you for all things in the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.